How it all went south.
Well, Jason, here we are, another episode.
Yeah.
How it all went south, and this episode is probably a little bit more. I don't want to say solemn, but it's we have had some fun on the show so far.
Yeah.
And hopefully we will in this episode. But it's definitely this episode is something that this story is something that I care about. This story, and you've heard me talk about this before. We've talked about me loving Alaska and really wanting to do any story that I can in Alaska.
And we were very close to actually trying to get this to be a thing. And it's just circumstance, life, people, things happening in motion.
Yeah.
You can't control it all.
No, and I was so bummed. This story is about 4 young Alaskan Native men who were convicted of killing 15-year-old John Hartman in 1997 in Fairbanks. Though there was a lack of physical evidence tying them into the crime and witness statements were later discovered to have been fabricated, the men were sentenced to decades in prison. Nearly 20 years later, they were freed and exonerated, though some are still not convinced of their innocence. This is the story of the Fairbanks Four. I'm Sean Kipe.
I'm Jason Hoke.
This is how it all went south. On October 11th, 1997, the Fairbanks, Alaska Police Department responded to a report of a young boy laying unresponsive on the corner of 9th and Barnett Street just before 3 a.m. He'd been severely beaten, kicked, and stomped on, and was bloodied and unconscious. Shoe prints were visible on his face. Police had no idea who this kid was. Later that morning, police provided a photo of that boy to the local news station KTVF to air in hopes of finding out his identity, and that young victim was soon identified as 15-year-old John Hartman. So the way that this whole story comes together is, you've kind of heard a little bit about what this story is. We already know there's 4 men who are convicted of this crime, spent years in prison, and then are eventually exonerated, which is very recent in the last couple of years. What I think is really unique and interesting about this story is how that happened, and the fact that for nearly 20 years that these guys were in prison, there was never a moment when there wasn't this huge rally cry of these guys are innocent. Like, how can these people be in prison? And that's really why they ended up getting exonerated. That just people for almost 20 years continued to raise such a stink about this and just would not relent, and more people joined that eventually, the system, the court system couldn't deny it anymore. They had to own up for mistakes that they'd made. And what I think is interesting is, aside from that, just how this case actually came together, how these guys were arrested and charged and made it through the court system when you look at the evidence, and you'll see what I mean. So at approximately 4:30 a.m. that same morning, police are called to break up a party at the Alaska Motor Inn. Several people, including 17-year-old Eugene Vent, are detained. 30 minutes later, Vent is being interrogated by police. They question him for 11 hours straight about the victim, John Hartman, while he's still heavily intoxicated from the night before, having a blood alcohol of 0.158. Now, legal intoxication is 0.08. This is a 17-year-old with 0.158. I want you to think about that. How inebriated, how drunk you have to be with that high of a blood alcohol level. Especially as a 17-year-old.
Yeah.
You're barely vertical at that point. I would think.
Who knows what? Yeah.
You don't drink that much, Jason. I mean, look, I've I've tied one on more than a time or two, and I would bet I've never been anywhere near that. Certainly not at 17 years old, and not being questioned about a murder while being intoxicated to that level, and as a minor without your parents present. So that's like red flag number one in this case.
It's like red flag number 1, 2, and 3.
1, 2, and 3. Yeah.
Putting someone in a very vulnerable position, no lawyer, no whatever, and
no parents, underage, and intoxicated. You know, not just like, hey, I had 2 drinks and I'm a little tipsy. This kid probably didn't know what he was saying. Police lie and tell Vent. They tell him that they found a bloody shoe print matching his at the crime scene. But Vent denies any involvement and asks to go home numerous times. At one point during the interrogation, Vent did, however, make incriminating statements, which, you know, when I read that first and I find out about that, I'm like, well, how could you make incriminating statements, or what do they consider incriminating statements? But we'll get into that and the method that was used to get that. You probably know where I'm going with that. Later that same afternoon, 20-year-old George Frese checks himself into the ER due to an injury to his foot while drinking heavily the night before. The nurse who tends to Frese's foot is the same who tended to the victim earlier that same day. She calls police and they begin to interrogate Frese while he's in the hospital. Frese maintains that he has no knowledge of the crime that took place hours before, but states that he was blackout drunk and couldn't remember much. But police, as with Eugene Vent, begin telling him they have witnesses and evidence placing him at the crime scene as well. Which, you know, that's kind of like a common thing, right? And I'm okay with that. You try to trip them up and get them to confess. If somebody is guilty of a crime like murder, they're going to lie to you. Right. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's not, did you kill him? Yeah. Shit, wait, what? It's not going to happen.
We've got the 3 other guys, and if you want the best deal, if you don't confess, kind of things is a common technique.
Yeah.
And at least to some things like false confessions and all kinds of stuff that we've never really thought about before, that you could actually falsely confess or trip yourself up or things like that.
Well, yeah, and that's why they always say, no matter what, innocent or guilty, don't say anything without just get your lawyer. Yeah. You know what I mean? Because even if you're completely innocent and you have no idea what they're talking about, who is this kid? Crime? What? You could say something inadvertently that could land you in prison for a serious crime. That's how crazy the system works. And like, there's those loopholes. 19-year-old Marvin Roberts. And by the way, you've heard two of these guys so far, both completely blackout drunk. Marvin Roberts is visited at his home by police after his name was given by Frese. He denies any involvement, and Roberts was the only suspect who was sober the night before, from what I could find. And I say that because, you know, at least 2 of these guys were completely inebriated when they were interrogated and questioned. And that is something that, you know, I've never been to Fairbanks, but I've researched it a lot, and there's not a lot to do, especially in the winter and at night. I mean, it's so cold. I mean, in the winters, you're talking like 80 below zero. So you go weeks or months like that.
It wasn't that bad for me growing up in Wisconsin, but there was certainly a vibe that says I have to get out of the house and there's only one place to go, or 2 places, which is the bar, the bowling alley with a bar. And that's what you do.
Yeah.
And literally the bar next to the bar next to the bar. Yeah. And it was a GM town. It was very working class. And, you know, there's not a whole lot. I mean, even driving somewhere is an effort, you know, in and of itself.
Yeah. And I mean, you know, especially if some place like Alaska is where it's in some respects still a boom or bust. I don't want to say a boom or bust town, but I mean, when the people that work in those oil rigs and the tundra and all the pipeline stuff, you know, they work for like 2 weeks at a time, crazy hours, and then those companies fly them into these towns and they just go ape shit. Strip clubs and bars and drugs and fights and, you know, spend their money and have a blast, and then they go back to work for another 2 weeks or whatever.
You know, it's interesting that you say that, because that exact same thing happened when we covered it in the Boomtown podcast.
Yeah.
You're a wildcatter on an oil rig. You may have a concrete plot that you put your trailer on. You're getting cash money, and there's only so many things to do. You are working
And they
18
pay
hours a
for
day,
everything.
and it's extremely hot.
Yeah.
And so what happened was, I remember riding around, the Permian Basin area of Texas, around Kermit and some other areas, and I remember Christian saying to me, yeah, the strippers in the strip clubs they actually have to pay to get in there because there's such a demand from these guys with their huge stacks of dollars. There's nothing else to do. So their version of that was either going to the bar or going to the strip club. And you had to be one of those dancers, you had to actually pay to get in. I had never heard of that before.
Pay to play. Yeah.
Yeah, and that was just super interesting. So in some respects, the temperature and location is wildly different, but there's a certain
The theme is the same.
yeah. Hey, did you watch the new True Detective season?
No.
Yeah. I mean, it's not in Fairbanks, but it's in even a more remote area where to go outside is extremely dangerous and like once you may lose the road entirely.
Yeah.
And there's certainly a vibe that feels very claustrophobic and very isolating and I mean, obviously just very cold and very, very alone. And again, not the same thing growing up in Wisconsin, but it feels like it's going to be forever until summer or spring comes.
Yeah.
It feels so long.
Yeah. So these guys, all three of those guys have said, I have no idea what you're talking about. 19-year-old Kevin Pease, the fourth, also was questioned that same day and denies knowing anything about this, having any knowledge or any role in the attack on this victim. The day after the attack, on October 12th, 15-year-old John Hartman succumbed to his injuries and passed away, now officially making this a murder investigation because, up to that point, and I think he was comatose. I mean, you're talking a day. I mean, I think when they found him, he was unconscious, had been laying out in the cold for 2 or 3 hours until he was found. So, they didn't get any information out of him, unfortunately, before he passed. In the days following Hartman's death, police began aggressively interrogating alibi witnesses, many of whom were young teens without their parents present at the time they were questioned. Another no-no in my book. Several did provide alibis for the four suspects, but charges were still brought against them for murder, and they were in court by October 21st to present their pleas. All four men pled not guilty. And, I mean, you look at the 21st of October, they're in court. The murder was on, the 11th. Really, the attack was on the 11th. So within 24 hours, they had four suspects identified. And not even 2 weeks later, they're in court.
It takes a lot of stones to be able to walk four guys into court like that, them all plead not guilty and still move this thing forward.
And hang your hat on
Right.
these four guys being guilty. Yeah. However, Eugene Vent and George Frese, regardless of the fact that all four men pled not guilty, did at one point admit to the crime while being questioned. And Vent said that Marvin Roberts was the driver of the car. They agreed that they had stomped and kicked the victim. So basically the crime was they drove up in a car, the four men jump out for whatever reason, attack this kid, and get back in the car and drive away. And they, were kicking, stomping. I don't think they robbed them or anything like that. It was just
a bloody fight.
Bloody fight, nothing better to do. Let's go mess with somebody. At least at this point, that's what they're thinking the crime is. They leave, they admit to parts or taking part in this crime. And again, the technique that was used, which we've talked about before in other cases, the Reed technique, was used for all four of these men. And if you don't know anything about the Reed technique, it's basically, I think it was developed in the 50s by maybe an FBI agent or something like that. John E. Reed, I think is his name. And it's very controversial. It's still used today by some law enforcement, but it's got a very high rate of false confessions that come from that technique. And it's essentially like you bring a suspect into the room and you're very rough and sort of attacking, and then you back off and become their friend, and you want to help them, and you understand, and you give them an out. Like, well, do you think you just, I know it's, do you think you just could have accident was an accident and you got scared? It's that kind of technique. And then you develop a bond and people end up confessing.
Yeah.
But the problem is that it's children and people with any kind of a mental handicap or mental deficiency are very, very susceptible to providing false confessions from that. And all of these guys, but one, were underage at the time of this, and two of them are completely shit-faced drunk.
Yeah.
So that technique probably shouldn't have been used, or they, and their parents weren't with them. These guys that are underage. So no lawyers, no nothing. They just said, "Did you do it?" And eventually they said, "Okay, yeah, we did." And they charged these 4 kids with murder. In the interrogation of Frese and Vent, it appears that the 2 men that were simply agreeing to information that they were being provided, or they were being led to answer questions that in some way would incriminate them. They provided answers like, I guess so, and I don't know, yeah. The story that would come together told that the 4 men were in a car driving around, saw Hartman and attacked him for no reason, beating and kicking him repeatedly, even stomping on his face. And at one point, Frese states, "All I know is that we kicked his ass and I don't know why." Both men answered numerous questions with a simple, "I don't know." And I read through, I know we were talking about this before, but I read through some of the transcripts of these interrogations, and it's almost laughable, because when I just said here, the things, I don't know, yeah, I guess so. And they charge these kids with murder based on this stuff. I mean, it's so,
What was the one that you just said about kicking their ass? I mean, that also seems pretty damning.
Yes, well, that's some of these implicating statements that they made. All I know is we kicked his ass and I don't know why.
Wow.
And
To have that come out of someone's mouth and them not do it is just wild to me. And this is, and I know you'll get into this, but this is why when people are, their sentences are vacated and they're found innocent, or they didn't do it, there's a lot of people that still don't believe them, because they're like, yeah, but you said it.
But you said it.
But you said it. It came out. It has to be true. It's on video. It's on camera. And that's the tough thing I mean, I'm working on something right now. Same thing, where it's like, you went to jail. Yeah, but I didn't do it. I never said I did it. Yeah, but you did. It's really hard to get around, and a certain portion of the community will never believe you.
And it's like the whole thing with false confessions, and there are always going to be people who jump down your throat and go, how could you not know? There's so many false confessions. Yeah, there are false confessions, and I get that. I just have a hard time finding, it's so difficult for me to, like, on a personal level, understand how I could ever get into the situation of being accused of I'm not talking like stealing a car.
Yeah.
And being like, okay, well, I don't want to get in bigger trouble. This is murder, man. Yeah. Like, you get charged with murder, you're going to prison, big boy prison, and maybe for the rest of your life. There is nothing in my mind that would ever get me to be like, okay, yeah, I did it. Can I get a better deal and less time in jail? Fuck no.
Yeah.
It's none of it. I didn't do it. My DNA is not there. I just will never understand how, but clearly people do. And part of those, the Reed technique and these and other techniques, coerced confessions and coerced statements and all kinds of stuff like that. Could you ever see yourself confessing this for any reason that you could think of, confessing to something like murder if you hadn't done it? Like, what would be a scenario where you would be like, okay, I did it. I'm going to say I did it.
If you did that, you would be thinking about your family, like, what does it mean for them versus me? I mean, the answer is no, of course, but I'm certainly privileged and lucky and all those things, and I would call a lawyer. I would have, the tools to be able to understand it and also act on that. So I would never be put in that situation.
You would hope. Yeah.
You would
I'm
hope.
sure these guys never thought they would be either.
Yeah.
But again, listening, just reading through those transcripts was like, how could you, even though they say some pretty damning things at some points, yeah, we kicked him in the face. I don't know why. That's such a blanket statement of like, yeah, sure. Okay. We did it. I don't know why. What do you want from me? Can I go home? I mean, it was literally like that, While the Fairbanks Four, as they would come to be known, and that was a name coined by their attorney, by the way, brilliant marketing tactic. While they were detained, police received statements from 3 other inmates in that same jail, one of whom was the victim's brother, claiming that the 4 men made incriminating statements while in jail together awaiting trial, which the men, of course, vehemently denied. The investigation was heavily scrutinized from the beginning as racial issues were called on, as the 4 men were Native Alaskans or American Indian. There is a long, long history, as you probably know, of prejudice against natives in Alaska. Yeah. We've talked about this before, but the missing indigenous women, like this, this story takes place in the late 90s, but it didn't really come full circle until just a couple years ago, 2019, something like that, I think it was. And the racism issue there is still such a big part of the story. I mean, and it sounds so weird to say that.
There's another part here too that you mentioned. It's just like the whole jailhouse informant thing is so fraught. When you really think about it, why would someone in jail want to give information up? They would want to do that to get a better deal for themselves and find a way out. And we see this over and over again, that these jailhouse informants are not credible witnesses and that there's something for them and they can pretty much make up anything. There's been lots of cases where they're hunting the right people in prison who want to make a deal, and it is who can come up first with the best deal. Like, it's another part of this too. So if that's the backbone of all of this, you don't really have that much, but it builds a case.
It helps to build a case. And, the jailhouse snitch thing, but top that off with one of the jailhouse snitches was the victim's brother.
Right.
So that adds a whole other level of like dicey to this. Like, of course that guy wants these guys to go to prison and stay there, right, and be convicted, But I will say too, and I talked about, the first time they started to be called the Fairbanks Four, and that name, their attorney came up with that. And I am going to say right now, just my opinion, but that is probably the smartest thing that attorney did. Seriously, you think about this, and I say that because when you have a public interest in a case like this, like we're standing behind something as the public, there's been an injustice, whatever it is, they came up with the holding 4 fingers up for the Fairbanks Four. It was a visual aid. They had the name that it's right. Fairbanks Four. It rolls off the tongue.
And it reminds me of Central Park 5.
Yeah, 100%. And that's where he got it from, I think. Yeah. Or it was that, or there's another something 7, the Chicago 7 or something.
Yeah.
But when you have something that is actually like marketable, it makes people remember it. When people talk about it, it just kind of sticks in your mind a little more. And that helped tremendously for this story to spread out far outside of Anchorage, Alaska, Fairbanks, Alaska.
Makes a great news headline.
Yeah, Anchorage. I just said Anchorage. They're not the Anchorage Four, they're the Fairbanks Four. But I mean, that was probably the single smartest thing that guy did to help this case and help these guys. And I mean, in my opinion. So these guys go to trial. The star witness for the prosecution in this case was a young man named Arlo Olson. And when I say young man, he was probably 15 or 16, something like that. He was young. I don't know how old exactly, but he told police that he saw the 4 suspects in a car together after beating up another man earlier in the evening before Hartman was attacked. Olson's account was from a distance of 550 feet away at night while admittingly under the influence of drugs and alcohol. The prosecution's case relied heavily on that testimony. I mean, again, there's like key moments that the prosecution hangs their hat on. Like, he said it. See, we got you now. And this is, like a 15 or 16-year-old kid on drugs and alcohol from over 500 feet away at night.
Well, and this brings up yet another thing that is fraught with error, and that is that eyewitness accounts are notoriously unreliable. People say they see things, and they don't see those things. And then you add distance, and then you add state of mind, then you add dark of night, and then whatever's in your system. Eyewitness accounts, even in the perfect atmosphere, the recount isn't what people think it is. And so it's notoriously just unreliable.
Yeah.
And we learned this too.
Yeah. And again, that's another, well, I'm not going to give it away, but we're going to come back to that young Arlo Olson, because that's ends up being, for me, one of the names you'll remember almost as much as the four guys convicted. Though there were many inconsistencies throughout the trial, there was zero physical evidence tying any of the Fairbanks Four to the murder or to the crime scene. Yet, they were each found guilty of murder and sentenced between 33 and 97 years, respectively. Arlo Olson would later recant his testimony in the year 2000, and several of the other testimonies used to convict the Fairbanks Four were later discredited altogether. So there were statements that were used in the trial to prosecute these guys that they later found out that it was you weren't even there, or you couldn't have seen, or somebody says I made it up, or crazy. And Arlo Olson, this is one of those main points of the prosecution. The prosecution's case recants his testimony. It says, no, that's actually not true. I didn't see him. Yet these guys are already in prison. Olson then, in 2001, again recants, saying he just wanted to get out of prison when he made his earlier recant. Yet again, in 2002, Olson recants. This is 3 recants, if you're keeping score, saying he was pressured with threats of perjury by investigators to go along with what they wanted him to say. So he makes his statement, then recants it, says, well, I just wanted a better deal. I wanted to get out of prison earlier. Then recants again, saying, no, I actually really did not see those guys. But I was pressured by police saying that they were going to threaten me with perjury.
So everyone's being coerced.
Everyone's being coerced. You can't trust anything at this point. Throughout 18 years, the Fairbanks Four were imprisoned. Movements to call out for justice for the men continued. When the gubernatorial elections were being held, protesters held up 4 fingers to represent the men, and it became a huge talking point of each candidate. I mean, this really became a huge movement in Alaska. The loudest speaking group was that of the Tanana Chiefs Conference, an Alaskan Natives nonprofit organization who fought fiercely for their release and called out racial prejudice and inequality due to the men's Native heritage. And these guys, without this group, I would say it's possible these guys would still be in prison. I mean, they ended up getting the Innocence Project, they ended up getting all those kinds of groups on board. They were going out, they were flyers, phone calls, calling governors, doing everything. And I hate to say it, but if it wasn't kind of like one of their own, who's going to do this other than us?
Yeah, and even when you have someone advocating on your behalf, my observation is you can have the smoking gun, it's the DNA, it's whatever the thing is that says they didn't do it or they did it. The wheels of justice take a very long time to get kind of unbound or untwirled. It is excruciatingly slow and not advantageous or helpful in a timely manner to help have someone get out. So it takes this constant beating of the drum by the public, by advocates, by lawyers, by it's really hard. These Innocence Projects movements and what they do is so admirable, and they're at the same time still limited by, a slow-moving system that doesn't want to be shaken, that doesn't want to just, the kind of the classic TV show, oh, you didn't do it, and then they unlock the person, they walk out of prison, and they're done, right? It's just not that way.
Yeah.
It is not that way at
And
all.
it's expensive.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about it, it takes a lot of money to fight for someone and advocate for their innocence for years and years and years. And it's a slow process on the best day. In 2001, a Fairbanks resident wrote a letter to the editor at the Fairbanks Daily News Miner, little paper there, and spurred the interest of a reporter named Brian O'Donohue, who began a decade-long investigation into the case of his own. Arlo Olson would once again recant to O'Donohue when he was interviewing him in 2008. That's 4 recants for Mr. Olson. And state that he was shown Marvin Roberts' car and coerced into the story by the lead investigator named Aaron Ring. If you look through this case and really read into it, this guy was sort of the lead. I mean, he was the lead investigator, but he was sort of the lead person, it seems, coercing all of these people. He had a narrative, and he painted that picture for each of these witnesses. I mean, taking a witness to the car and going, this is the car you saw, right? This is, you saw him it was about 10 o'clock, right? I mean, it's just like that's what was happening. A civil rights review of the case was called for, and the Alaska Innocence Project is founded and takes on the case in 2008 as well. In 2011, nearly 15 years after the murder of John Hartman, a man named William Holmes made a jailhouse confession implicating himself and 4 other men who were all teens at the time. Holmes stated that he and 4 other men left a house party the night of October 11th, 1997, drove to downtown Fairbanks, and killed Hartman for fun, citing that they were looking for, quote, drunk natives to assault, but could not find a suitable victim and instead found Hartman. At least one of the other men responsible, Rashawn Brown, was already in prison at the time of the confession for murdering 2 other people in Oregon back in 1999. A murder he had premeditated. And that was, I think, he had set up, he was going to buy drugs from a guy and a girl, and he robbed them and killed them, shot them. So he was in prison for that already. Fairbanks police had a copy of Holmes's confession for 2 years and did nothing with it, filing it away in a box. This guy confesses in prison for the murder. Goes into detail, sworn affidavit, the whole 9. Fairbanks police, you've got all these groups calling for the Fairbanks Four is innocent. They need a new trial. They've been framed however it is. This guy has a confession that sits in their office in a box collecting dust for 2 years. That's
gutting. It's
just gutting. And if you imagine these 4 kids, I mean, these guys were kids when they went to prison.
Well, and I was saying about how the wheels of justice roll slowly. It's not helpful when you can't even get the ball rolling if something's stuck away in a box. Like, it's that much more outrageous.
Yeah. And it kind of, I don't know what the Fairbanks Police Department's like these days, because I imagine after all of this, there was a bit of a shakeup there. But God, that just goes to show like what their sort of intentions are, or I don't know. Maybe it doesn't show. Maybe it leaves a bigger question for me of like, if these guys are innocent, what do you care? Find the right guys, but
And not to generalize, but I think there is something about mistakes were made and this person's not innocent, but we're not going to come out and just say that we did wrong or that something happened that was a mistake, even if it wasn't that person. They can't get themselves on the other side of this to say, because they're all locked arms, right? Like the police department is like, it's like other divisions, like the military. It's like, no, we're all saying the same thing or we're not saying anything at all.
Right.
So it's very much of a brotherhood, sisterhood, whatever. And to admit in a public setting that this has happened is admitting everything by virtue of that. My observation is seeing some other cases and stories that I've worked on that despite being obvious, despite it being outrageous, it still doesn't happen like you think it should. And
Yeah.
here's another example of that.
Well, yeah, and you're leaving yourself open to, if you admit, hey, we're wrong, we got the wrong guys, you're going to be liable for something. Are you going to lose your job? You lose your pension? Get fired? Is that, the state's going to get sued?
Well, the civil cases around this, when you think of O.J. Simpson, like civil cases can be sometimes more damning than the actual criminal cases that happened.
Well, after 18 years of protests by the public, the police being called out for not properly investigating the crime and focusing only on the Fairbanks Four, though there was no physical evidence tying them to the crime, and the public backlash over Holmes's confession, the city of Fairbanks finally gave in. Because I think at that point they had no other choice,
Yeah.
In June of 2015, Marvin Roberts was paroled and told that if he signed a statement taking any liability off of the city of Fairbanks, the police department, or the state of Alaska, he could not see, and that he could not seek any monetary compensation for being imprisoned for almost 2 decades wrongly. The other 3 men would be set free if he would agree to that. Of course, what does he do? Roberts signs the agreement. And on December 17th, 2015, the Fairbanks Four were freed, erasing their convictions. And I'd love to say, because it's true, I can say it, all 4 men did sue.
Good.
And sued big.
But by the way, you're going to get paroled, and you're going to be able to help your friends, but there's conditions.
Not paroled, exonerated.
Exonerated.
Yeah.
Okay.
But yeah.
But still, like, we can't even make this easy. That, again, speaking of outrageous, it's saying, it's like these cases where, like, we admit to no wrongdoing even though we've stroked a check to you for $51 million.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff just doesn't play with me, and I think a lot of the public, but there's always something. There's always a condition around this that keeps people at a distance. And here we are again,
Yeah, I mean, and what a shitty thing, to hold against someone who's spent the last 18 years in prison. By this point that they didn't do the crime. They didn't commit the crime. Yeah. That's why you're letting them out. And making a deal saying, hey, look, those 3 other lives, those 3 other people who are friends of yours who you've been in this, we'll let them out if you sign this paper. Or let them sit in jail for another 60 or 70 years, right, and you have fun on parole, pal. We'll see you around town. I mean, that's so fucked up to me. Of course he's going to sign that. I would sign almost anything at that point, because how could you let 3 other people that are innocent sit in prison for the rest of their lives?
Well, and this is when it comes back to, again, the Fairbanks Four.
Yeah.
Right? Being on the other side of when they're all out.
Yeah.
The 4 can then turn around and sue.
And they did. They did, with Roberts citing that he was pressured into signing the release of the other men, which of course he was. Eventually, $5 million was awarded, and all of the men but Roberts agreed to that. They took $5 million and split it between the 3 of them. He is still suing on his own. And you remember, I spoke with Marvin Roberts when I was really looking. I wanted to do this story, and I still do. I really want to tell this story in a big series.
Yeah.
Because I think there's just so many angles to this that are important, aside from just 4 guys who had half their lives taken from them for the wrong reasons. I spoke to him, and this is a guy who is not, I don't know him well, but just from what I got from talking to him, he ain't gonna back down, man. He is not gonna. I'm not gonna accept your, $5 million split between. And
you know why that is?
You robbed me of my life, so much of my life.
If I don't have my name, I don't have anything, and it's a very ingrained way of thinking because of the pushback of people, even as he gets out, that say, yeah, I know you cut a deal, but you're still guilty in my brain. And so I think there's a lot of people that do get out on a wrongful conviction. There's money but they have to give something up. And if they don't get their name back, it's not worth it to them because they've suffered enough, and their name is the most important thing. I know this. I've talked to people directly without getting into details. That is the most important thing. And I really don't know that, but I respect that. And I sympathize with that.
Yeah. And I think, it's kind of like, how do you put a dollar amount on 18 years of your life?
Yeah.
Right. And what you miss out on. And I always think about, when I talk to, especially wrongful convictions, of course, with the Michael Chappell case in the Land of Lies. I mean, I firmly believe that guy is not guilty of murder. He's been in prison for 30 years now. But when you look at someone like that and gets out of prison, and even you give him a couple $1 million, that's never worth I always think that all the experiences I've had in, let's say, 18 years, the last 18 years of my life, the places I've been, the people I've met, the good times that I've had, that would have all been erased, and there's no amount of money.
Well, and a lot of states now are saying, for every year that you've spent in prison, you need to, because this is happening over and over.
It's like $100,000, which is, great. All right. That's something.
Right.
That's equivalent financially to making $100,000 a year,
It didn't exist a few years ago.
No.
And now it does. And I think it's a step in the right direction. Yeah. But I would also say that the laws around that reward are not as straightforward and not equal for kind of all parties to be able to just get that money. It's not that easy.
Yeah.
It's not that easy.
I hope we never have to find out how difficult it is.
Yeah.
Honestly. That's the story of the Fairbanks Four.
Incredible.
Yeah, it's an incredible story. I encourage people to go and check it out. We'll put some links and stuff up in the YouTube video. Thanks for joining us. I'm Sean Kipe. That's Jason Hoke. And this is how it all went south. We'll see you next time.